And I'd had a history of migraines. I'd been hospitalized. I was on medication from the age of 15. And when I found out that I was intolerant to tomatoes, because very often it's the foods you love because you're getting an adrenaline and cortisol hit that you can be intolerant to. When I found out I was intolerant to tomatoes, I mean, firstly, I was devastated. Secondly, I thought, well, let's give it a go. And 3 weeks later, I'd lost a stone, changing nothing else but giving up tomatoes. And I was then, after that, I started weaning off my medication and I haven't had a migraine since.
How you doing? Today we're going to talk a lot about food, and well, I've been talking about food for a few years. This lovely lady here, we went out for dinner the other day after doing some work for a charity we're both involved with called the Public Health Collaboration, and shocked me with some things that I've been doing wrong myself. But before we get there, Claire, tell everybody about yourself.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name's Claire Snowdon-Darling and I am predominantly a menopause coach and educator, but within the realms of being a menopause coach, we actually have to look at all aspects of the human body and how our hormones affect different things like digestion and our immunity. And so this is where we were talking about some of the bigger, broader areas of what I do. And you had a few aha moments, I think.
I did have a few aha moments. So if you've watched any podcasts in the past, we talk a lot about how we eat sugar or we get stressed. And then insulin comes up, and if we've eaten too much sugar, insulin grabs that sugar, puts it into the body and stores it as body fat. But we've also talked in the past that when you're stressed, a hormone called cortisol gets released because the body can't tell the difference between being chased by a lion or just stressed because the dishwasher's broken again. So the body stress is stress. And what that does, because it thinks the lion's chasing you, cortisol puts sugar back into the bloodstream for energy. But now you've got this internal war because insulin's trying to get rid of it, cortisol's trying to put it back. And when we're in a stressful situation for a long time, chronic stress, then we've got this problem going on. But two things you said to me, which I had no idea about, and I want to pick up on both of them, is other things that cause stress in the body. And the other week you said, it could be a food intolerance. I went, what do you mean? You said, well, if somebody's got a food intolerance, that in itself can cause stress, therefore cause cortisol. Explain.
Okay, so I want to start off by saying that a food intolerance is not an allergy. An allergy is a full immune response, and people know when they have allergies. But actually, food intolerances, low-level food intolerances, are often very responsible for a lot of the symptoms that people could avoid going to the GP for. So I have a little story actually. So I was obsessed with tomatoes. And when I went through my training, tomatoes were one of the red flags sort of foods. And I'd had a history of migraines. I'd been hospitalized. I was on medication from the age of 15. And when I found out that I was intolerant to tomatoes, because very often it's the foods you love because you're getting an adrenaline and cortisol hit that you can be intolerant to. When I found out I was intolerant to tomatoes, I mean, firstly, I was devastated. Secondly, I thought, well, let's give it a go. And 3 weeks later, I'd lost a stone, changing nothing else but giving up tomatoes. And I was then, after that, I started weaning off my medication and I haven't had a migraine since.
Even in that few sentences, there's about three things I need to pick up on. So tomatoes inherently don't make you fat. They're not like high sugar or anything like that. And in fact, on the list of carb grams per 100, in themselves they don't make you fat. You're saying because you were intolerant to them, that set off the cortisol, and it was the cortisol that was piling on the weight, not the tomatoes.
Yes.
So that was the cause, not necessarily the effect. Isn't that fascinating?
Isn't it? And then the cortisol would have been causing the destabilization of my hormones, which then led to the migraines. So things like headaches, migraines, weight, irritable bowel syndrome, recurring bladder infections. When someone comes into my clinic, I'm going, if I'm looking at that health history form, thinking, okay, we need to be looking at food intolerances here.
And your partner recently had a similar experience whilst wearing a CGM. Explain that one.
Yeah, so wearing a CGM, we thought, okay, well, let's just do a little bit of a test. And so He's not intolerant to all grains. So he was eating spelt, checked his CGM. It was kind of, the reading, I can't remember the number, but it was pretty much in line with where we would have thought it would have got to. But then later on, he ate a piece of bread that was wheat-based, which he is intolerant to. And literally the same piece of spelt toast, bit of wheat toast. Blood sugars went through the roof and totally spiked based on the cortisol response from eating something he was intolerant to.
It's fascinating because, for example, many people in the West are lactose intolerant to some degree. I mean, how many people could be overweight or having more cortisol just because they're drinking a lot of milk, thinking milk's good for you, get calcium from it, etc., and yet they're actually intolerant to it?
Well, that's a huge issue. I mean, that's a whole subject in itself, but we actually have more osteoporosis in cow's milk drinking countries than we do in non-cow's milk drinking countries. So that actually says that the calcium that we can get from that, we might not be able to absorb anyway. It might not be available to us because of how we have to process it. But you're right. Actually, cow's milk and wheat are one of the first things that we look at when someone comes into clinic. So I work with something called the hierarchy of food intolerances. So the thing is, you can have a food intolerance test and it can tell you that you're intolerant to 60 things. It's kind of a bit pointless.
This is based on your DNA?
Yeah, or your hair or something. It's sort of pointless because that's just a snapshot of how your immune system is functioning now.
Yeah.
So with the research that I've done, we discovered that there are what we call gateway allergens. Like, imagine the big foundation blocks that when we eliminate those, that other 60 you might not really truly be intolerant to. They might just be a reaction because your immune system's gone a bit crazy. So the big things to focus on are these foundational pieces, and the first two would be wheat and milk. Not all gluten-free is a big thing, but not everyone is intolerant to all grains. We could have a different conversation about whether or not they're good for us from an insulin perspective, but this is purely from the intolerance factor.
Yeah.
Once people have cleared those out, and I always say, you're not going to eliminate everything if you're well. It's about taking one step at a time to find out, when your symptoms then disappear.
Yeah.
So the next thing we start looking at would be the nightshade family. So the deadly nightshades: tomatoes, potatoes, aubergine, pepper. And again, one of my favorite sayings is, what is it you're eating every day? Because you're not going to be intolerant.
Cauliflower.
Okay. They're not on my list until much later.
Oh, good.
But I often say, you're not going to, the arthritis in your knee is not going to be coming from kiwi if you only eat kiwi once a month.
Yes.
That's not where it's coming from. What are you eating every day? Yeah. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, they can feature in people's diet daily. And actually there's high levels of a form of cyanide in the deadly nightshades, and some people's bodies just can't process it. And so we always then look at the nightshade family. And then as you go further up the hierarchy, you start to find egg whites. Some people, especially if they have sort of immune issues, they might not be able to tolerate egg whites. Then we end up with nuts and seeds, and then we can go on to other vegetables. So it's not this never-ending list, and it is actually quite a clear process that we can actually start to remove inflammation from people's diets.
Now, you said something else in that sentence a minute ago that really struck a chord. You said you were having the tomatoes and you really loved the tomatoes, but it could have been that the adrenaline kicked in because it was defending you. But we all know adrenaline in some ways gets us excited. When we exercise, we run, we feel great because we're pumped up with adrenaline linked to cortisol. So the things you like, you could be liking them. I think this is what you're saying, correct or wrong? You could be liking them because they're not good for you.
Yeah, because you're having an adrenaline hit off of it. So you're basically being an adrenaline junkie. So this is what's often behind the cravings,
right?
Is actually this adrenaline response.
Yeah. So if there's something on your list there that you really, really like, it could be the adrenaline because it's not doing you any good.
Exactly.
That is frightening.
And when you start to see sort of lactose intolerant children, but they can't go to bed without their bottle, I must have my bottle, but then they're often wired and can't sleep. Those are, and the children go, I don't want to eat anything else. I just won't eat anything else. I must have this. Like, that's always a red flag of, I think there's a food intolerance there.
Amazing. So I'm helping a guy out at the moment, I won't say a name, and very overweight, close to morbidly obese. Tried everything, right? He's got his food where it should be now, Comes back to me, Steve, still not working, can't shift the weight. So we looked at his sleep, he wasn't sleeping enough. So we gave him some sleep hygiene tips. Now sleeping, weight still not coming off. Doing a bit of exercise, appropriate exercise, the right exercise for him, still not coming off. And I went, I don't know. But it could be, then I should be saying, what do you eat every day that is not on those list of things you want to avoid that puts your insulin up? But what do you eat regularly that might not be causing insulin to go up, but might be causing your cortisol to go up?
Exactly.
Wow.
And often we can be eating foods that are signaling to our body to go into fat storage.
Yes.
Because of how our food historically was seasonal. And so, I know this is a conversation that we were having last night. When I've got people...
I'll try and look surprised. But I was deadly surprised this one last night. Okay.
When we've got people who are struggling with really sort of stubborn weight issues, and you've looked at everything else, you're doing the work on the insulin, you're working on their gut health, all of those things, they're eating good proteins. But we have this phrase now, don't we? Good fats, good fats. Actually, there's some fascinating research that's come out around, if you look at the acid that makes up a fat, we've got plant fats, we've got meat fats. The plant fat, the acid, in terms of biochemistry, that makes it is called linoleic acid. The acid that makes the meat fat is stearic acid. Now, again, it's not going to be for everybody. Some people just need to, drop some carbs and then their weight shifts. But for the people where it's really stubborn, if they're saying, I'm eating loads of nuts because they're a really good fat, I'm thinking, aha. Because what the research told us... This is what she thought
last night. Aha.
Because
why won't my last 2 pounds go, Claire?
Why?
Because
there? You love nuts, right?
I love nuts.
Because you love the nuts, which are a great
nuts
fat.
Nuts are great because they don't put my insulin up.
And they're a great fat, aren't they?
They are.
Except they're made up of linoleic acid. And the new research shows that when we ingest linoleic acid, and this makes so much sense, doesn't it?
You've told me.
When we ingest linoleic acid, there is a signal that's sent to our fat cells to store the fat because winter's coming. Nuts are only available to us when winter is coming. So we have to hold on to that fat. But when we eat meat fat, the signal that gets sent to our fat cells is we are in feast time, burn fat.
Quite logical, really. The squirrel doesn't go around chasing mice before he goes and hibernates for the winter.
Exactly.
He eats nuts.
Exactly.
And it's the type of acid that does it. Isn't that fascinating?
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I've said the same pretty much around, if late afternoon, you're just lying around on the sofa, the body thinks if you're indoors all the time, the body keeps thinking winter's coming, get outside a bit more.
Exactly.
Winter's not coming,
exactly.
You're out and you're moving and so on. Fascinating. Now, the other area, which I had no idea about this, because for me, cortisol came from within, but you were saying to me that the skin can make cortisol. Explain.
I know, we're just in a cortisol soup, aren't we?
At the moment we are. We'll get to someone else in a minute, don't worry.
It's just everywhere. We're on this sort of battle against cortisol. Yeah, there are actually...
It's a battle against us, I think.
It is, yeah, that is. And it's a battle against our lifestyle because we've just lost, any of our primal way of living, haven't we? So our skin also makes cortisol, and that's in response to chemicals and also light. So one of my favorite aha moments was a lot of people say they feel like they'll get a really bad migraine or they'll feel awful after they've been around strip lights. And one of the reasons for that is, yes, it's quite bright, but actually it's because your body is starting to make cortisol. So what happens is your body, a strip light mimics daylight. It's a 360-degree light.
Incandescent as opposed to incandescent.
Exactly. So the body goes, oh, good, I'm outside, I'm getting sun, I can start to produce melanin, and then there's going to be some vitamin D3. So it starts to go through this process, but then none of that process happens because it's not real sunlight. And in response to it, the body then starts going, okay, this is a stress situation. If this isn't good for me, it might be attacking me. So I'm going to start to produce cortisol to start the signal, because our signals, the hormones also come from our senses to start the signal that I'm in danger and I need to get away from this situation. So we also do that in response to toxic chemicals. So the stuff, that's often in perfumes and toiletries and cleaning products, that our skin is actually trying to get us away from the danger by producing cortisol.
So it's not that easy if you're overweight to say it's one thing or another. It could be that a certain lady that I'm coaching, who I know puts on a lot of makeup and a lot of creams and potions, that when I've looked at it, I've told her that these are awful ingredients. Like, I wouldn't even smear my dog in what you're putting on every day. In fact, quick story. A clip on the BBC about 4 years ago, they got 3 blouses, and they were identical blouses. And they set fire to them all at the same time. And one went up in flames straight away, one took a little bit longer, and one took about a minute to go up in flames. And the fire brigade said, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but something like 15 women a year die from being burnt to death because their clothes are going up in flames. And then they said the difference between the 3 is the one was straight out the packet, brand new. One had been worn for 6 months and one had been worn for 12 months. And the point was, there is so much paraffins and inflammatory things in the creams and potions that particularly ladies are wearing and using, that even when you're washing the clothes, those chemicals still stay in the clothes, and they set fire just like that. And I went, yes, that's terrible that amount of people are dying every year for their clothes catching fire. But how many then tens of thousands are now getting those same chemicals leaching into the skin? And of course I had a friend of mine say, that's rubbish, nothing goes to the skin. I went, what are you wearing right now? He said, clothes. No, what are you wearing right now? And he was wearing a nicotine patch. So anyway, it was a bit of a joke at the time. But so things do get through the skin. We're not totally impermeable. But it's not just that then, it's that so not only is that doing harm and putting more, there are 500 chemicals in our body today that weren't there in the 60s.
It's shocking, isn't it? And so many of the chemicals in toiletries, unless they're clean, and that you have done your research and they are clean, and don't have those chemicals in them. But those chemicals often come from a genre of chemicals called endocrine disruptors. And if our endocrine is our chemical message, our hormone messengers, why are we trying to disrupt our hormone system with we could be eating as cleanly as possible and doing everything right and supplementing, and then slathering on something that's disrupting our hormones.
It's frightening, isn't it? And I guess you mentioned my favourite word then in the entire dictionary, which is primal. These things weren't happening a couple of 100 years ago. Our body isn't used to fake light. Our body's not used to fake creams and potions and lotions.
Exactly.
So we're getting cortisol from being food intolerant to things we might not even know about. Cortisol from potions and lotions on our screen. Talk to me about, is cortisol and IBS linked?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Massively. So I remember years ago when I was creating an IBS protocol with a gastroenterologist, and I said something about IBS, and he went, well, it's nothing to do with the gut, it's a hormone issue. And I went, well, why aren't endocrinologists dealing with it then? And he said, because it lives in the gut. And I was like, well, your best friend's an endocrinologist, you talk about IBS? He went, no. I was like, oh, so is anybody talking about hormones being this issue with IBS? He said, no. Ultimately, it is a build-up in the gut of, because IBS does affect women more than it affects men. And what we know of irritable bowel syndrome is there is a bigger issue in the microbiome, higher levels of cortisol, higher levels of estrogen. We get the higher our insulin becomes, a hormone called motilin drops down. And motilin is responsible for the food moving through our gut, so that kind of griping.
Yeah.
But of course, as soon as we get any cortisol spiking in our body thinks that we're having to run away from saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah.
And so we switch into our sympathetic nervous system, which is our get up and go.
Yeah.
But it's in the wind down and relax, the parasympathetic nervous system, where we're making our digestive enzymes. So cortisol being present tells our body not to create digestive enzymes.
Yeah.
The cortisol's spiked insulin, which has reduced motilin, so now I can't even break my food down, but I couldn't even move it through my gut.
So you can't even get the vitamins, the minerals out.
Exactly. And now it can't even move through the gut, so it's all sat there.
Yep.
I've got more cortisol than the body knows what to do with, so it's literally putting it into the bowel.
Yep.
And then the cortisol, we know cortisol is an anti-inflammatory, but if you think about the gut moves by peristalsis, now it's getting stuck. So it all makes so much sense when you start to think about irritable bowel syndrome actually being a hormone imbalance with the motilin, the insulin, the cortisol, the lack of digestive enzymes. And ultimately, let's remove our food intolerances, let's eat right, let's reduce our stress.
Does that in any way, shape or form then relate to thyroid problems?
Absolutely. Yeah, because the problem is that I like to say that the adrenal glands where we make our cortisol, I call them the diva of the endocrine system. And if they're taking up all of the attention, the thyroid's busily trying to do its job and it can't. And so it's like it's trying to do all this work in the background, but no one's listening to it. Everyone, the endocrine's only paying attention to the adrenals that are shouting at us, and they get pretty tired doing that too. But the thyroid then is doing all this work in the background, and it's like it's just being completely ignored. And ultimately, it's then not able to function properly. That's my very simplistic way of describing the endocrine. And so often people are focusing on thyroid when actually they need to be focusing on stress.
Yeah.
It's harder to look at stress, isn't it? Because that's everything in our lives. So what do we have to take a big red pen to?
Yeah, and if I look at lots of the, particularly predominantly females that I know that they've got thyroid problems, my wife's kicked in after mum and dad got divorced, others have kicked in after a bad pregnancy. It tends to come post some sort of big trauma event. Absolutely.
And the body has just gone into this sort of crazy place of dealing with all the stress, and now it literally hasn't got, I call it the bandwidth, it just doesn't have the bandwidth anymore to function as it was.
And in many ways, we talk about insulin resistance being at the root cause of many, many chronic illnesses. But what we're saying is, and we always talk about food to start off with, 80% of problems start in the kitchen, and you can't excise your fork and so on. But we've really got to look at those other root causes in a real serious way that can affect that raising of insulin. Because we know for a fact, once cortisol's up, you're putting sugar back into the bloodstream, then insulin has to go up. So you're going to have hyperinsulinemia. And then all those horrible things around, twice as likely to get heart disease, certain cancers, certainly breast cancer, certainly prostate cancer. So we really got to try and bring these stress levels back under control. I want to ask you next, because we touched on this before, but I want the wider public to know this as well. So I've got a daughter, been on the pill since she was 13, I think, or 14. Mainly because of heavy periods and bad acne, and nobody wants acne, but certainly you don't want it in your teenage years. I don't understand why the pill's supposed to be helping. I don't like it because I don't like medication. How do I talk her into not having the pill for that? And what would the alternatives be?
Great question. I'll try and keep it succinct. So let's just rewind to the fact that she had heavy periods before she went on the pill. So the thing I spend quite a lot of time talking about is perimenopause, where it's categorized, estrogen and progesterone tracking, and then progesterone falls off a cliff and we have more estrogen. We have a higher ratio of estrogen to progesterone. So this is called estrogen dominance. Now, the problem is that's fine in perimenopause, that's supposed to happen. The thing is, because we are so stressed, and what happens when we're stressed, the ways that progesterone is made is it goes through a process. It starts with a precursor hormone called pregnenolone, and pregnenolone basically goes on to make progesterone, unless we're under stress, and then it turns that progesterone straight into cortisol. So it's one like that land. There's a hormone called pregnenolone that makes progesterone unless we're stressed, and then it will make cortisol instead.
Right.
So because we are seeing younger generations of predominantly women, men are stressed too, but in this case, with the progesterone issue, having so much stress, and I sort of, my daughter's 19, I've saw that the mock year, then the GCSEs, and it's just stress, and social media and all the other things. We are seeing younger and younger women coming into clinic, 12, 13 even, just as their periods are starting, and they're actually progesterone deficient. So they are sort of in an early, it's like a mimicking a perimenopause, if you like.
Yeah.
But it can come out as heavy periods, amenorrhea. It can come out in so many different ways. But when if they're lucky enough to have blood tests, what's showing is that their progesterone is on the floor.
And is it an easy test? Progesterone, is it just like a finger prick, or is it a bit of blood?
It's a bit of blood.
Doctors happy to do it
no,
if you go in and ask?
Not always. Again, it's one of those where you need to empower yourself and be your own warrior.
And I love GPs. I've got lots of friends at GPs, but they're under that immense pressure for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sort of max, to have that whole conversation. Have you tried this? Have you tried that? Have you tried
and
that?
the pill would be the only
probably
response.
And I know a lot of my doctor friends hate it when the patient comes and goes, I want. They're not going in for any advice. I want to go on the pill. Why? Because I've read on the internet that's going to make my periods less.
And that tends to be the response that the GPs have got. Like we tend to think that the GPs have got all the answers, and they don't. And that's hard. That's as hard for them as it is for us. So the first thing is, I want to look at, I'm not just going to say to a 14-year-old girl, well, then, HRT for progesterone. We actually have to look at why isn't she making progesterone? And the first place I look is diet. So we need to make sure that she's eating enough protein. You've got to get off the pasta and, get off the Subways. Yeah. Get onto, good proteins at every meal. Make sure that that's balanced. Being careful with the right exercise. Starting to become aware of mental stress and food intolerances. So if we can do everything that we can to bring her stress down, then her body will actually start to make, hopefully, more progesterone. We can also do some work with, nutritional supplementation. We also need to look at estrogen dominance, and estrogen dominance doesn't just come because our progesterone's dropped off. It comes because of these toxic chemicals. What they actually do is they mimic estrogen. They're called xenoestrogens, and all the BPA plastics issues. It's an estrogen mimicker. And so we actually do need to do some gut clearing to sort out her microbiome so that her body isn't overwhelmed with this fake estrogen as well. So we're building up her we're building up her progesterone naturally. We're bringing down the estrogen, and that is then data. The thing is, it's not a quick fix. It's going to take a good few months. The acne is absolutely a sign of estrogen dominance and this dysbiosis in her gut. That's where that's coming from.
And of course, we put a lot of makeup on because it's all about comparison on the internet and Insta and all those sorts of things. Too much makeup with more chemicals, adding to the problem, more cortisol. I guess it's not a localized thing with cortisol, though, is it? That just affects your overall cortisol levels. Interesting one. Where is BPA banned?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah. God, I can't wait to tell you this. So we know that BPA is bad for us. It's bad for us. But we know those squidgy plastic bottles, probably the worst invention known to man, going and buying a plastic bottle when you could just get it out of the tap. We know that there's BPA leaking into the water. Where have they banned BPA? The governments know it's bad, but there's so much tax, so much profit out of those water bottles, we can't stop it there. They've stopped now. It's illegal to put BPA in a baby's drinking bottle.
And that's it.
That's it. So we know it's not good for us. We'll just do it for a bit of PR that goes, well, let's stop the infants from having it, but everybody else, you carry on because we need all the tax and profit. It's my opinion. Could be completely wrong on that, but that is true, the fact that it has been banned. And when I try and get men to stop drinking from plastic bottles, I do it mainly for their health, but also mainly for the planet, because it's the worst thing ever invented. There are more bits of plastic in the ocean now than there are fish. And I paid for some research. About 11 years ago, I sponsored a big charity called Earthwatch to do some research on it. And even back then, if you took all the plastic on the planet and ground it into dust, on every bit of the planet, including the North Pole, the South Pole, every bit of landmass, we'd be up to our knees in dust. So and there was no plastic till the 60s. So this is this has happened since I was born. So it drives me mad. But I say to guys, you want boobs? What boobs do you? They go, no, I don't want boobs. Stop drinking from plastic bottles because of estrogen.
Yeah, estrogen.
It mimics estrogen.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've covered that one. Now, I'm shortly going to go carnivore for a whole month with my good friend Dr. Dan Maggs as a bit of an experiment. We're going to go really strict. We're going to go just meat, eggs, possibly fish. Any advice around that area?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes.
Don't do it. Do it.
Do it.
Yeah?
Do it.
Okay.
I am evangelical. So
Okay.
I did a full carnivore reset for, it was actually 10 months, and I've been meat-based, so predominantly eating 1 kilo of ruminant meat a day. But
why
now
is the ruminant bit important?
Yes. So
and just clarify what you mean with that. That's
so
cows,
sheep,
deer,
deer, goat. Don't get so much goat in this country anymore, sadly. So predominantly ruminant. And the reason for that is, there's quite a few reasons for that. One of the reasons, going back to the linoleic acid, is we predominantly feed our animals corn and soy, which are high in omega-6, and it actually changes their protein to be more linoleic acid.
Yeah, you are what you eat eats.
Exactly right. They're not eating a species-appropriate diet.
Yes.
So we're actually creating more linoleic acid in our protein. And so, of course, everyone's going, well, I'm eating loads of chicken. Again, stubborn weight loss. Why aren't I losing weight? I'm eating all this chicken. I'm not eating nuts. Okay, it's because we're feeding it corn and soy. So you're still having that signaling. The ruminant animals, however, because their digestive systems are different, we are still feeding them corn and soy.
Not so bad in the UK. I mean,
it's not so bad, to be fair.
Most cows are outdoors, and lamb, I don't think is really a problem anywhere on the planet. But
No, but even still, because there's a big conversation about should it be grass-fed, can it? Actually, what we know when you look at the composition of the meat is it doesn't really matter. If you can afford grass-fed, go for your life, enjoy it. If you can't, and that's a barrier to eating more ruminant meat, sort of doesn't matter, because the cows want you to be so well that they will break down the corn and the soy and the linoleic acid and all of that, and they break down pesticides.
It's a nice thought that the cow we're just about to put down wants us to be well.
Wants us to be well. It's like it's offering itself to you.
I like the thought. I might get picked up on that another day. But
I know.
You said something about bees as well, I remember.
Yeah, we did. Bees, bees love us. They want us to be well. So we actually know that their meat doesn't contain pesticides, pollution, and it has the antibiotics for sure, but it's actually pretty good.
Not so much in the UK.
Again, not so much in the UK. There's
if
quite
we were
a lot
sitting here in America, it'd be a totally different conversation. I mean, in America, more antibiotics are used on cattle than on humans.
Yeah, it's unreal, isn't it?
And the hormones and all things to fatten them up and grow them fast. And they also need all that treatment because they're force feeding them corn, and then that's actually part of the problem for global warming, because the corn's in Kansas, the cows in wherever, and the whole thing's a complete nonsense. But in the UK, luckily, from what I understand, speak to a lot of farmers, they're out there grazing like they should do. Normally,
exactly. So once we've actually turned back to a diet, because also, if you think about it, if you go right back to hunting in tribes, one chicken, not going to feed a tribe.
No.
And it's not going to feed, or it's going to feed a very small amount of them. So you have to do a lot of hunting to feed a tribe. You find one big animal, that's your tribe fed for a good few days.
At least,
At least.
Yeah.
So we would have eaten more ruminant meat than we do poultry and pork. So that's the first part. So my experience of turning carnivore is that these sort of, I can't even call them blood sugar imbalances, because I've eaten carefully for so long. They were blood sugar niggles.
Okay.
Like, just after I ate, I just could never stop I just want something sweet. Just a little square of dark chocolate. Nothing too impactive, but I need something sweet. After literally 6 weeks of doing carnivore, that completely went.
No desire then for sugar, and it just wiped the slate clean, effectively.
Like if you put a pudding in front of me, you couldn't pay me to eat it.
Yeah.
And then just gut issues that I've just struggled with, they just went. So lots and lots of just underlying tiny niggles with my health completely changed on carnivore.
Yeah, and a good friend of mine, an ex-professional footballer, who wrote the 12-week programs with us, call it MARS, Movement, Aerobics, Resistance and Stance. Christian Daly looks so ripped, and he's been doing it for about 6 months now. And he said he has steak, eggs, a lot of eggs, and blue cheese. And he said he loves it. And steak and eggs. Cheese, should I be particular about what type of cheese, or just go with what I like?
So again, it comes down to people's symptoms. So this is what I tend to advise, is what we know is that, especially if you haven't had symptoms before you go carnivore, being in keto for a certain amount of time can be very beneficial for humans. But after a while, it can actually play havoc with your thyroid. It can actually cause quite a lot of imbalances. So long-term ketosis, we still don't have enough research to know whether or not that is the optimum health. But a lot of the people who
And
are...
when you say long term, should I worry about a month or
No,
about a year?
we're talking years.
Okay.
Yeah, years. So a lot of the
Although
people
Sean Baker's been doing it for years and looks amazing.
So some people do,
Yeah.
but there is this new wave of people talking about meat-based diets. So, for example, I'll still have my kilo of meat, but then I will sometimes add in some seasonal fruits or root vegetables.
Yeah.
We talk about dairy, so going back to the dairy. Again, if you had dairy-related symptoms, terrible skin, terrible IBS, autoimmune conditions, arthritis, try it. You might actually, the reset might actually mean that you can tolerate the dairy. But for a lot of people, they can't. But we start to find that there are different types of dairy. There's A1 casein, which tends to come from the cows where it's all sort of mass farmed. And there's A2 casein, which might be the more rare species of cows, but also goat, or some goats, buffalo, other animals that produce milk, sheep's ewes, for example. A lot of people do much better on the A2 casein than they do on the A1 casein.
So, change the subject slightly, you've gone on a bit of an elimination diet because you've got IBS or you can't move that weight. There's even a different, you might have just got rid of all the cheese and gone, oh, that's fixed my problem. But you could possibly introduce some cheeses, but if they come from the other type of casein.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And then see how you do. So it does become quite fascinating. And then there's quite a lot of conversation about raw honey now, because if it's raw, and what they mean by raw is it's not been boiled and pasteurized, but also that the honey has been fed, the bees have been fed honey and not sugar water.
Right.
There's actually a lot of research that shows that it balances your blood sugars because it actually contains naturally quite a lot of nitric oxide, which is phenomenally good for humans. So again, the bees love us and want us to be well.
Okay, let's stop and think about that for a second, because we know honey is glucose. We know the effect that has on insulin. We also know that it's a fruit. So we know it's fructose as well. Well, it's not a fruit, is it? But we know it contains a lot of fructose, which we know is bad for the liver because fructose never comes out of the liver. It has to be turned into body fat. So there's two negatives in there, but you're saying potentially the fact it's got nitric oxides may outweigh the negatives of the sugar.
Yeah, there's loads of research that I'm
my head
happy
in,
to
by
send
the
you.
way.
I know, it's fascinating. So it's actually a raw natural honey, sort of straight from a traditional beekeeper.
Yeah.
It will be the perfect balance of fructose and glucose to make the sucrose, right? It's perfect. It's a perfect balance.
But you could say, well, then you'd say the same about table sugar, wouldn't you? Half.
Well,
we know
not
that's
really,
deadly.
because it's so refined. And then it's the nitric oxide that's the winner here.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the beekeepers come along, or humans came along and went, okay, well, I'm going to take all your honey and we'll just replace it with sugar water. But what happened was then the glucose element went up. So in what we call the fake honey, or the sham honey that you're buying in the supermarket, it's got a much elevated glucose component. So now it's not a balanced carbohydrate.
Because while what you eat eats, and we've been feeding the bees the cheap stuff so we can take their honey.
Exactly. But then in this raw honey that's not been boiled, it also contains nitric oxide, which is a blood sugar stabilizer. So that's, again, fascinating. And I would say, go carefully if you are in any inflammatory response. But if you've got to a point where you're not and your diabetes is under control, there is a lot of people who have done the sort of checks with the continuous glucose monitors, and there's no blood sugar spiking. No.
So nitric oxide, I mean, we haven't known about this for that long. Although Mr. Noble, who invented the Nobel Peace Prize, do you know this story about him? Mm-hmm. So his background was dynamite. So he only did the Nobel Peace Prize to leave a different legacy other than the fact he invented dynamite. What they'd have a big pot, and they were stirring the nitrogen to make the dynamite. And anybody that worked in it, and they had to do it slowly, they had a one-legged stall so they didn't fall asleep, otherwise, boom, the whole factory goes. And they were stirring the nitrogen. But anybody that was stirring it that had an angina, it went away.
Wow.
It went away. And then they'd go and work somewhere else and it'd come back. Then they'd go back and work for him at the dynamite factory, angina would go. And that's where we first learned that nitric oxide was good for relaxing the arteries. And of course, you've probably heard that Viagra didn't start out as Viagra. It started out as a pill for the heart. And then when they did the clinical trials, and the end of the clinical trial, preclinical trials, none of the men sent the drugs back, and they went, oh, it's a bit strange. We normally get about 30-40% back, and they did the research and found out that it did something else. But yeah, anything you can do to get the body to do more nitric oxide, sunshine, exercise, beetroot, and that sounds like honey as well, good for you.
Yeah.
Fascinating indeed. I want to talk, and you said something last night that I still can't get my head around, because we've been taught for a long time that you know, half the plate should be full of greens. I think I've said it as a bit of a cop out when I can't think what else to say. You know, meat and then half your plate as greens. And I said one of the reasons you want your greens is because their self-defense system, their antioxidants, when we eat them, help us defend off things. You know, we ward off the free radicals because we're eating antioxidants, and therefore that's good for the body. You went, that might not be strictly the case.
It might not be strictly the case. So again, this is one of the fundamental principles behind the carnivore movement and the meat-based movement, is that those what's the word I'm looking for? Those self-attacking, self-defense. That's it. Defense chemicals are actually contributing to our inflammatory response. So again, we could argue, well, eating them occasionally, that should be fine. Yeah, we're omnivores. We should be able to eat anything occasionally, but we tend to these days load our plates up with the greens. The same thing. And actually what we're now discovering is it's quite inflammatory. And because most people have got elevated, you know, insulin, they've got the elevated cortisol, too much estrogen, now adding in this thing that our bodies can't get the good bits out of those foods, they're just in an inflammatory response. And so that's actually the fundamental principles of removing them from your diet. And one of the things that people ask me is, but hang on, what about the vitamins and minerals? And when you actually start looking at it from this sort of clinical perspective, what you actually discover is, well, the fat-soluble vitamins are in the meat fat.
Yeah.
The water-soluble vitamins are actually in
the B's and C,
the offal.
Yeah.
In fact, you know, adrenal glands are the biggest powerhouse, packed full of vitamin C. You get your satisfaction from the muscle meat, and also there's quite a lot of water in there. And we get our fiber from the gristly bits that you would usually go, oh no, I don't want to eat that. But actually, you know, we used to eat everything.
Parts of the animal, yeah.
Exactly. And so we can have this complete meal in the meat. And we would have just been so excited to find in-season fruit. And also that means the savoury fruits, so things like butternut squash or courgette, for example, just not the things that we grow, like, you know, broccoli and asparagus. They would have been, again, you don't see them when you're out walking very often.
That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
For the rest of, I don't know, human history, 2 million years, it's only really changed in the last couple of thousand years. And back then you would only ever eat what was in season, because we didn't have fridges or microwaves in the cave. But you'd be so diverse.
Yeah.
You go and buy you find a bit of fungus here, and you find some seeds there at that time of year, then something that was growing here, then maybe roots a bit more of the year, because underground they last a bit longer. But you have such a diverse, other than your meat, which you could get most of the time all year round, other than that, everything was so seasonal that you would never overdose on just one thing.
No, exactly. And now we have people making their smoothie with spinach every single morning. So many oxalates causing so much inflammation. So
the trick with the greens then, try and get it organic, try and get it in season, but really diversify it as much as you can. Really
diversify it. And it would be going back to, shaking it up and not just having all greens, actually.
Yeah. Mushrooms?
The jury's out. I love a mushroom.
It's something low carb. It's the lowest carb anything you can eat out of the ground. Yeah,
it is. And again, some of the sort of real forethinkers in the carnivore movement would kind of go, no, they're terrible. But ultimately, my stance is, what can you tolerate? At which point, like, I love sauerkraut. That would be like a bit of a no-no, but I can tolerate it. I don't have any symptoms on it.
There's a lot of benefits. I thought that sauerkraut, isn't that supposed to be good for the microbiome?
Because of the fermentation aspect, it can be great. But if you've got, like, you know, a lot of oxalates, a lot of gout, things like that, then maybe the cabbage isn't so good. So again, with a lot of things we can find evidence for and we can find evidence against. So I would always say, go with what's right for you, but being really, really objective about it and kind of, okay, I'm going to be unemotional while I make this observation in myself.
Brilliant. touched on gout. Tell me about gout. Gout in the diet. How does that link to the diet?
So things like high levels of oxalates. It's basically toxins your body isn't clearing, and then it causes this symptom. And so we've always attributed it to high rich diet, so butters and meats, but actually alcohol, high levels of oxalates, that's where we sometimes even nuts. We need to start looking at these, not just the meat. And that's what a problem I think is with a lot of meat. People have this issue about saturated fat and red meat. It's all been demonized. Actually, the studies were really flawed when we were looking at them, and they took the hit. And actually, it was some of these other things that went unnoticed.
Well, they were beyond flawed. You're being polite.
Yeah, I am being really polite. Yeah,
It's just immorally corrupt.
Yeah.
And fun. Anyway, we won't go there. But so the wine one I get, the red wine in particular. I was reading something the other day as well that too much fructose.
Yeah, absolutely, too much fructose. Yeah, definitely. And then a lot of the sweeteners like the agave nectars, which people think they're good, and they're actually horrendous.
If you had to sweeten something up, would you have a preference?
Stevia. Yeah.
Erythritol maybe.
Yeah, unless they've got underlying gut imbalances. So things like small intestine bacterial overgrowth, loves sugar, lives on sugar, thrives on sugar. And so until you've really got that microbiome sorted, stuff like erythritol or xylitol can really cause an issue.
Yeah, but I'm thinking my kids now, he has my little one, 7-year-old, I give him a erythritol lolly every day because his mates are all having sweets, and apparently that's good for your teeth.
Yeah.
So actually good for your teeth, not bad for your teeth. So he's got that. We've skirted around with IBS and the microbiome. And something just came back to me that I was going to ask you right towards the beginning, that you were saying back to the fact that once you stopped having tomatoes, that helped with so many different things like your migraines. Part of liking it, you said, could be the adrenaline of it, because you're firing up adrenaline because your body's disagreeing with it, and the brain's misconceiving that as, I want more of tomato. Do you buy also into that the microbiome, if it becomes too populated with certain species, they demand what they want to be fed as well?
Absolutely.
So back to tomatoes, it could have been the microbiome, the gut bacteria you'd got that were predominantly, it depends which species like tomato, I don't know which ones they are, but it could be that was out of balance, and the adrenaline, and therefore...
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, whatever species are there, they are going to want to stay alive. And so they absolutely... There's a great book actually called Survival of the Sickest, which talks about how we're being invaded by bacteria that will change our choices because they want to survive. And we definitely see that in the case of small intestine bacterial overgrowth. People just making food choices to keep the bacteria alive. So that's when it becomes not even about willpower. It's like, I'm trying here and I just can't make this change. And it's like, well... Okay.
Yeah, there's one strand called Firmicutes, and they're anything but cute, and they love sugar. They absolutely love sugar. In some of the plantations, sugar plantations out in the Caribbean, quite often they'll have to shut down the entire factory where they're processing it because this little bacteria gets into the factory and it just destroys it. It just loves gobbling up sugar. And of the two main dominant species in the stomach, Bacteroidetes, which are very good, and Firmicutes, if you've got too many of those, that in itself could be, for some people, the biggest driver of weight.
Yeah.
In fact, have you heard the experiment where they took the two twins, one that was slender, one that was obese, the two twins, they took their feces and they got two groups of 50 mice born by C-section, so they've got no microbiome whatsoever, and they smeared the feces from the slim twin on 50 of the mice, and from the overweight obese twin, the feces over the skin, and of course, then the mice, and they start to get ingested. All 50 of the slender ones stayed slender on the same diet. All 50 of those from the obese twin all became obese, just because of the gut bacteria that came out in the poop.
I mean, the microbiome it's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, we only discovered it in 2012, so we're still playing catch up on what it does. But when we've started to get an idea of, how amazing it is, and yes, of course, medically there are some reasons for doing fecal transplants, but they often fail because we haven't got the environment right in the gut that we're trying to put it into. And so, like, I'm not a big fan of probiotics because with people who have got irritable bowel syndrome, we actually, there was a statistic where there's something like 85% of irritable bowel syndrome is caused by small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which is ultimately living off of sugar. It's any sugar that it's trying to live off of, and it's desiring sugar. And if we have small intestine bacterial overgrowth, people say, oh, I took a probiotic, but I felt awful. I got really bloated. I'm like, well, I like to think of the small intestine, SIBO, we call it small intestine bacterial overgrowth. I like to think of SIBO as being like zombie bacteria. And if you're putting in 1 billion new bacteria that the SIBO just kill off, well, now I've got to deal with this. But, you know, they're fantastically interesting because you start to discover that they're even eating your digestive enzymes. So you're not breaking down your food. They're literally trying to create an environment, a sort of mush that is causing all sorts of issues, which is why it then becomes such a bigger picture, especially with, you know, someone with acne and heavy periods. It's like, okay, where do we think the cortisol's coming from? Like, it's not hard to see. And
the more this conversation carries on, the more I'm really thinking that it is about diversity, because on every way you look at it, you know, somebody wrote a year ago, no, 2 years ago, because I quoted it in my book, the plastic bag in the supermarket with the mixed salad in, the one in their experiment had got 20 times the legal limit of chlorine in there to stop it all going mushy. So you're ingesting that. So if you just had that every day thinking, oh, good, I've got 6 or 7 different vegetables in there, or they were probably artificial fertilizers, pesticides. Now you've got the chemicals in it. And if that's your go-to every day in your salad, putting it into your stir fry, your salad, whatever, thinking you're doing good, if you keep doing the same one, you could then completely colonize a bacteria that's not good for you. So even if we're living in a world where if you still subscribe to the fact you have lots of greens, if you just keep the choices so narrow, you're heading for a crisis. You need to massively, even if you subscribe to that half the plate should be greens, it should be different greens every day.
Yeah, I agree. And actually just going back to the diversity, and you know, one of the big what are they doing every day issues is wheat. And like I said, I can argue, you know, grains in multiple different ways, but when it comes to the food intolerance aspect, wheat is just, I call it arsenic. Like, you know, you used to be able to stand a 6 foot tall man in a wheat field. And then in 1969, Norman Borlaug came along, hybrid the grain. We now have these uniform grains, but nobody checked the gluten content. And, you know, it's now estimated that the gluten content is around 85%, whereas in other grains, it's about 8%. Yeah. And that was bad enough. But then in the 1980s, we started spraying it with glyphosate, Monsanto Roundup, which is an antimicrobial. So, you know, by another name, it's like acting like an antibiotic. So every time we eat wheat, we're destroying our gut microbiome, which is, you know, predominantly our immune system. That's where inflammation's coming from. And talk about doing it every day. I mean, I see people's diets where they're eating wheat 5 times in a day because of the biscuits and sandwiches and toast. Yeah. And we're literally feeding our kids this antimicrobial with this high gluten content that is literally just poisoning us.
Yeah, they've had it for breakfast, they've had it at school for lunch, the sandwiches at 11 first of all, because then the insulin has crashed the sugar, so now they're hungry, but the brain's going hungry, so give me something that's going to turn into sugar quickly. So they have the sandwich, then the crap at school for lunch, and it drives me mad this. And then they get home, and because I've been on this roller coaster of insulin and sugar all day long, the thing the kid wants is now a pizza. Well, show me any bit of nutrition today, any. And then we wonder why we're getting ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, all these things that a good friend of mine, Patrick Holford, that you're going to hear at the next conference, honestly, and he's done a lot of research around this, is going, I think most of these things are related to the lack of the B vitamins. And because they're not fat soluble, we can't store them. Where are they coming from? Because if you're only going crap all day long, and driving that, of course, now, as we've just learned, adrenaline.
Yeah.
Driving that, as you've taught me today, you've got adrenaline, you've got the fact that the bacteria in the stomach's asking for that. Nobody comes home and goes, well, we don't sit there at 11 o'clock at night going, I'll just have a nice big steak. Because there's nothing driving that.
Exactly.
It's saying, go and get me a pack of crisps, because I'm going to get adrenaline rush because it's not doing me any good.
Exactly.
Get me a pack of crisps because they want sugar.
But we can change it, can't
we? Oh, yes,
we? We really
absolutely.
can. That's the
Speak to people like
thing.
you and understanding it and going, I'm fed up of being brainwashed by the big corporates. I'm fed up of a world where it's all about corporate greed, whether they be the food manufacturers, whether they be big pharmaceutical, and also fed up of going, well, there's a pill for every ill. No, yeah, we say, and my whole group of companies is around health, we say we want to prevent the preventables and cure the curables. That's all we're about as a company. How do we prevent things from going wrong, and how do we cure the things that have already gone wrong that you can cure? You can't cure everything. You can cure diabetes, obesity, and things like that, but type 2. But that only can happen. It'll never happen from lobbying governments. I don't think. We've tried, for goodness years, with our charity. That hasn't worked. It's no good lobbying the supermarkets. They'll only supply us what we'll buy. It's no good really looking for law changes. We've got to get it from the ground up. We've got to get this groundswell up. Goes, I'm fed up being advertised. You know, why have McDonald's got 4 E numbers in the bun alone? Yeah. Yes, you can tell me all day long that your patty is real beef. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'll probably believe them on that. But even on their website, they tell us there's 4 E numbers. Well, in the old days, you only needed 3 ingredients of bread. Why have we got 17 in a piece in a loaf now? So, number one causes tooth decay in kids now in the UK. Bread. How about that? Bread. Yeah. Because the enzymes break it to sugar straight away. Exactly. And what they're having? Bread all day long. Yeah. Oh, it's been fascinating. Look, we could talk all day long. We'll go to our conference next year and then we'll do this again afterwards. Lovely. That's been absolutely my pleasure. I've really enjoyed having you here. Thanks very much.